The reason I got started on this research line was several years ago when I was working at Yale. I was connected with an organization called Plant for the Planet, and they run the UN's Billion Tree campaign. So they were planting 1 billion trees to save the world. The problem was they didn't know if 1 billion trees was a lot or a little, because we didn't know how many trees there were to start with. So the impact of 1 billion trees could have been massive or minor. We didn't really know. So I decided I got connected with them, and I thought I'd do a bit of background reading and just see what information we do have about the current state of the world's forests, just a basic understanding of how many trees there are. I thought it would be a very brief study. But I realized that something that characterizes our understanding of global scale ecology is that we just rely overwhelmingly on satellite data. There's obviously MODIS and satellite layers and information about spectral reflectance and canopy cover that is really, really valuable. But what we do is we just take layers of satellite information, and then we pile on other layers of satellite information, and we make new layers of modeled satellite information, and then we use them to model new models, and it just sort of goes around in circles. And we know lots of sort of modeled characteristics of the ecosystem without actually knowing what's going on below the surface. So in my naivety, I thought, well, we just need a little bit of ground-sourced information, and so I started contacting academics and researchers around the world who might have done on-the-ground stem density estimates. I just wanted a load of estimates of tree density from around the world, so I could say, in these parts of the world, there's lots of trees, and in these parts of the world, there's not many. And we ended up collecting lots of stem density estimates from all over the world, and eventually collected lots of the main national forest inventories, which ended up providing us with over 400,000 plots. So we collected far more than I was ever expecting to. But with this information, we then had reasonably good coverage of the global forest system. Obviously, we're missing massive chunks in the tropics. Obviously, some of the hardest places to collect data from. But still, we still have in the tens of thousands of data points across the tropics, and obviously hundreds of thousands across the northern hemisphere. And with this huge coverage of all the world's forested regions, we could then start to predict spatial patterns within the global forest system about how many trees there are in all the different parts of the world. So we use a very simple process that we use throughout a lot of our research. We take data from lots of places, we pair it up with satellite information or global scale information on soil, climate, geology, topography, and obviously a lot of satellite spectral information. And we then generate, and we use that information to generate spatially explicit models that can help us to understand the variables, the drivers of those environmental patterns, and that will allow us to interpolate between those dots to fill in all the locations. And the more information we have, the stronger those predictions get. So it started out using linear models and then quickly moved to basic machine learning models. Whichever algorithms come out best, we use those algorithms to understand the drivers of those forest patterns and predict them into the other areas. And by doing that, by interpolating or extrapolating that data across the global forest system, we can come up with a very basic model of global tree density. And this is very useful because it tells us within every pixel, with every kilometer-sized pixel, it approximates how many trees there are in each of those pixels, and it can help us to understand basic information about how many trees there are in each of the main biogeographic parts of the world. By adding up all of the pixels, we can then see that there are approximately 3 trillion trees on Earth. And obviously this was of interest to a lot of non-scientists, particularly the Billion Tree campaign, because it really put their efforts in context. If you imagine each of these trees that I've drawn here represents 1 billion trees, the addition of another billion was going to be great, but nowhere near the impact that they were hoping for. So they called it the Trillion Tree campaign, and now they're going to save the world by planting 1 trillion trees across the world. And it's certainly going to have the magnitude of the impact they're hoping for. And while it sounds a bit like lofty goals, like ambitious thinking, since that study came out, they've already restored over 14 billion trees effectively. These are trees that have been monitored and evaluated several years after planting, not just number of trees planted. So they've had a lot of unsuccessful ones as well, but a lot of successful restoration efforts, and they're amplifying their efforts all the time to aim for this lofty new goal. So just having meaningful understanding of what their targets should be has really allowed them to amplify their efforts. But obviously this map of tree density doesn't just tell us where trees are, It tells us how many trees are being lost each year. We can overlay maps, temporal layers of forest cover to identify how many trees are lost each year. And we can approximate how many trees could be restored within the IUCN's restoration areas, just to come up with large-scale general goals about how many trees could be restored and where they could be restored. But obviously, the map of tree density, from my perspective, isn't just about the number of trees. But by far the most important feature of this is that it tells us a really prominent feature of habitat structure that doesn't come from satellite information. It's ground-sourced information, and it tells us about the density of trees in those locations around the world. If you look, these two pictures represent regions that have similar latitudes, and they look very similar from space. The satellite spectral imagery looks very similar from space, but you can see this part is red, and this part is in a sort of greeny area, and it indicates that the tree density is very strongly different. And anyone who's walked through a forest, an open or a closed canopy forest, can tell that a closed canopy forest and open canopy forest are very different in terms of the understory vegetation that live there, the plants and animals that can live there, and the way nutrients and elements are recycled within those ecosystems are very, very different. So it's just one feature of one ecosystem characteristic that can help us to better understand the forest structure around the world. And for that reason, it's been used in various species distribution modeling efforts and biodiversity modeling efforts. And it's also being incorporated into some of the large-scale sort of carbon cycle models, like the one I mentioned at the very beginning, my very first slide. The reason I got